So, David, it's a great privilege and pleasure to be able to interview David MacDougall, whose work I've known for many years. And I always start by asking you when you were born, where you were born, that sort of thing. So,
well, I was born in New Hampshire, in the U.S., where I lived for perhaps only 3 or 4 days because my parents were living across the border in Vermont. And they were both teachers at a progressive, experimental, co-educational boarding school. This was in 1939, so it was toward the end of, well, just after the Depression, and my father was trained as a civil engineer. He was Canadian. My mother was from the US, and they had both been teaching during the Depression, and then they joined together with some other teachers with this idealized project of creating a new school, a new kind of school. So that was the first 5 years or so of my life. We were there.
Tell me something about your parents and whether ways they might have influenced you and their characters. Anything significant? My father was the son of a minister in Canada from a fairly, I wouldn't say puritanical, but fairly strict sort of background, from which he broke completely and decided to go into sciences and engineering. My mother was from a family in New York, and both New York City and upstate New York. Her father was a surgeon, a lung surgeon, and quite well known. And they met on a boat going to Europe as students, and were married in Paris in the British embassy in Paris. My father almost married the wrong woman because their friend who was coming to be the witness arrived early. My mother was late, and they were signing papers, and at a certain point they realized they'd almost married my father to the witness instead of to my mother, but they sorted that out eventually. So they stayed there for some time and then came back to America. Tell me, what about your mother's character? Was she influential? Was she a great reader or?
She was. My mother was. She was very interested in literature and the arts. I think my father was too, but he had this training in sciences, and I think there was always a feeling that he sort of represented the scientific side of the family, and she more the arts and humanities side. But in fact, he played musical instruments. He was quite creative, especially when he was young. Doing, for example, he made very intricate wooden puppets that he carved and things like that. But they sort of represented a balance in a way between arts and sciences.
Were they interested in film?
I think my mother particularly was, interested and knowledgeable about film, but neither of them were great cinephiles, I wouldn't say. But I certainly grew up seeing a lot of films. I remember being taken by my mother many times to see a new film that was playing, and films from other countries. And yes, I think she was probably more influential in, exposing me to film at an early age.
Do you have brothers and sisters, or?
I had one older brother by 7 years. So he more or less disappeared off to school and university at a certain age, and it was a little like growing up as an only child, for some of those years.
What was your first school? Where was that? That was in.
Well, we moved to New York from Vermont during the war, and so I would have gone to kindergarten actually we made two moves. We moved first to the outskirts of New York when I went to kindergarten, and then into the center of the city, into Manhattan. And my mother was teaching at a school called the Dalton School, which happened to be right across the street from where we lived. So I went to school there from grade 1 through, would have been through grade 8.
A long time.
Long time.
Is it a bit strange going to school at your mother's school?
Not really, because she was teaching in a completely different section of the school. They also had a secondary school, which was just girls' school, and the lower school was boys and girls. So I really didn't see that much of her. I didn't have that burden of having a parent-teacher.
Being teased by your parents. Were there any teachers? There's often a teacher or teachers who have a big influence at some point in turning you into what you later become, or infusing you. Was there anyone in particular in your life at that school that you remember?
Yes, there was one teacher who I think was, whom I admired greatly, and who I think was very influential. He was a geography teacher.
You remember his name?
John Seeger, and he was Pete Seeger's brother.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, so it's spelled S-E-A, is it?
It's S-E-E-G-E-R.
Yeah.
And like his brother, he also was a singer and played guitar with his wife. And but what was really extraordinary about him was his ability to tell stories. He, instead of having normal geography classes, he would often just have us all sit around him and tell these long, extraordinary tales about adventurers in foreign places, and he would take chapters from books that he had read and retell them. And of course we were learning a lot of geography in the process, but we didn't really realize that. So he was extraordinarily interesting and very kind also. I remember that about him. And I suppose partly through this storytelling, he emerged as somebody who was very different from run-of-the-mill teachers. He sort of had this magical ability to take us into another imaginary world.
It would be tempting to try and link that to your filming attempts to take us into different worlds, but I suppose it...
Maybe we should avoid that temptation, yeah. Although I do remember that, in fact, the first film I ever saw was Nanook of the North.
Really?
Because it was shown at our school, I'm sure, when I was in 2nd or 3rd grade, something like that.
And that's another temptation.
That's another temptation to be avoided.
To fly her to you. I mean, were you impressed by the film and interested by it?
Well, it stuck in my mind, I know that. That's about all I can remember about it. I just remember this vivid memory of Nanook and the life there, and getting into the kayaks and all of that.
Seal hunting, yes. Was there any subject that you particularly warmed to, maybe geography, but any others? Were you beginning to form an interest in the arts or the sciences or anything up to 8th grade? I
suppose mostly writing, English, literature. But I don't think I was, excessively academic at that age. I perhaps did those things a bit better than other things, but it wasn't really dominant. I did enjoy sciences. We also had a very good chemistry teacher, whom I remember very well, and made extraordinary stinks in the laboratory and other things, electrifying ourselves with static electricity.
And was there any sort of visual component in? I mean, were you a photographer or painter or?
Yeah, it's true. I started taking photographs at a very early age. I can't remember what my first camera was. It was, I think it was a little plastic box brownie that took 127 film, and then I later bought a camera that I got by mail order, which took half frames, so I could get twice as many pictures on the same roll. I think that camera cost 50 cents and a box top from a cereal box. And then I got a bit more serious about it later when I was maybe 10, 11, 12. I began doing a lot of street photography, and I got a much better camera. I got a small Voigtlander camera with a nice lens. And I also began to work in the darkroom because the Dalton School had a darkroom that we could use.
So you developed your own?
So I began to learn how to develop film and print film, and I'd even done that at home, in fact, in a closet that I'd made into a darkroom. And I carried that on right through secondary school, where they also had a good darkroom. And so I did quite a bit of still photography then.
So this takes you through to what age? I don't know the American system. By 8th grade, it's, how old are you?
You're about 13, 12, 13, and well, yeah, 13. At the age of 13, I went away to boarding school, to Putney, and was there for 4 years, and then I went on to university after that.
Oh, since you've, again, all these temptations, you've had an interest in boarding schools later in your life. Do you think there was anything about your boarding school at Putney that foreshadowed the Doon School that comes up later?
Well, I did see a lot of resemblances between these boarding schools, despite the fact that they're totally different in philosophy and atmosphere. But I think there's certain fundamentals that remain the same in the boarding school experience, which is, first of all, being away from your family and having to make a life with other people. And then, the necessity for certain common things like you have to have dormitories to sleep in, you have to have meals at regular times, you have to have classes. There's usually a mid-morning break in every school. There's usually, sports events, athletics. So I think a lot of these things remain constant. Bells ringing, even in a progressive school. Those things, I think I found familiar when I started filming in the two schools that I've been filming in India.
Yes. I mean, it's a gross question, but did you basically enjoy your time at school, or was it the usual thing that it started awful and got better as you got more seniority?
I think I had a pretty good time at school. Yeah, it wasn't a terrible experience. I wasn't homesick. I think I had reached the point where I was ready to go away from home, and enjoyed the freedom of that, enjoyed my friends' company. And the school was very stimulating in many ways. It had a very good music program. It had, I suppose things got better in the sense that I began to find my way into forms of achievement that were open to me in the school, like writing for the school literary magazine and writing for the newspaper, and eventually I edited the magazine in my senior year. So those, yes, I think you do begin to find your feet, and then you begin to find what you're good at, and gain, you gain satisfaction from that.
You weren't a games player?
Not particularly, no. I did a lot of fencing in my last year, and when I went on to university, I was on the fencing team there, but I wasn't very keen on team sports.
You're short-sighted, I presume?
Yeah.
When did that develop?
Oh, I think in primary school I was beginning to be, yeah.
Is that often, there's known as the myopic complex, which is to do with short-sightedness. I read a book about this once.
Yeah.
And it sometimes inhibits games playing, or rather rough games, if you have.
Yeah, it may have done in my case. I'm not sure. I did play a lot of basketball in primary school, despite the glasses. But but I didn't really enjoy team sports so much. What I liked about fencing is that it was an individual skill that you could develop, and had a kind of elegance to it, which I enjoyed.
Were there any teachers at that school who again influenced you?
Yes, several. There were several there. An English, one of my English teachers in particular. It was a school that tended to get rather idiosyncratic teachers from time to time, and that was, I think, that was good for all of us. Teachers who had quirks and special passions, and for example, this English teacher, he was an African American who had been educated in England, who had run for governor of a state, and of course never won. I think on either the Communist Party or some other left-wing party. He had been a wrestler. He'd been a preacher, and he loved literature, and it was just a very wonderful combination. He was very outgoing. I'd never met anybody like him before. You know, he was wonderful.
What was his name?
What was his name? His name was
Don't worry.
Jeff Campbell. Jeff Campbell. Yeah. And then in my senior year, I also had an English teacher that I quite admired, who was a lover of Yeats's poetry.
And you were a lover of Yeats's poetry?
Not
above all.
Particularly, not above all.
Just that I am.
Yes, I mean I do now like Yeats very much, but I think it was. What was good about that is to see somebody who had a passion for something and wasn't just teaching the curriculum, you know.
And you continued with your photography?
At school, yes.
At school.
Yes.
You didn't start any filming or anything at school?
No, I really didn't begin to do that until university, and even then in a fairly minor way. I had a camera that had belonged to my great aunt, and it was one of the early 16mm Bell and Howell cameras. And I think it dated from mid-30s, something like that. And I did begin to use that in university to make little films about my friends. That was really all. And trying to concoct rather embarrassingly artful films. I'm not sure what influenced those films particularly, but you know, you would go to the fairgrounds and take these wonderful shots of the Ferris wheel and things spinning around, and
I can imagine them now.
Yeah.
Were you beginning to specialize in English now? I mean,
yes, then I majored in English at Harvard, and I did begin to take anthropology, which I suppose English and anthropology were the two subjects that I really
at Harvard.
Liked most at Harvard, yeah. Yeah.
And again, were there particular either colleagues or teachers who influenced you at Harvard?
Well, I think I came in a kind of intermediate period in Harvard's anthropology department. I remember Barbara Whiting was teaching then, and she was you know, the exponent of a kind of psychoanalytic, cross-cultural anthropology, which I didn't particularly sympathize with, but when she was teaching sort of, you know, first-year anthropology, I was certainly very excited by that. And the first ethnography I read was the Newer.
Really?
And I thought it was, you know, I found it so evocative of another way of life that, in the meantime, I had been to Africa, by the way, I should say. When I was 14, my father was working on a project in Angola. It was a survey of a river system in Angola. A very wide-ranging survey over the whole of the northern part of Angola, involving the Kwanza and the Bengo rivers. And my parents decided or offered me the chance just to come and take a term off from school. They quite rightly realized that I'd learn a lot more doing that than if I stayed in school. So I actually missed half of my second year in secondary school plus the whole summer. And I went to Angola for about 6 months. And that was really very valuable, I think, because it fulfilled a lot of these desires to see other countries, and I suppose the sorts of things that my geography teacher had been talking about, places like that. And I also got to go along with some of the engineers who were surveying the rivers. And we would go up these river tributaries in dugout canoes with crocodiles rushing off the banks and slapping into the water around us. And then I actually got a kind of job for the project in which I did all their photographic processing, because they had a darkroom in Luanda in their main office. And they gave me that job to do all that. So I was involved. Practically, I wasn't just a tourist. I felt I really had a role in things. And of course that continued my interest in photography, and I took a lot of pictures as well.
Do you think that's why some of your first films were made in Africa, because of that early contact?
Well, from that time on, I always had an interest in Africa. Maybe even before I went to Africa, I had an interest in Africa. And I suppose it was more accidental that I ended up making films there at the beginning, because that came out of a postgraduate university project that I was involved in. That was sort of the point of entry for filmmaking there. But we can get into that later, perhaps.
Some reason now suddenly pressed it to go shooting out. Now we are back again. Were there other, with the anthropologists, were there other anthropologists apart from Whiting who were, Harvard is a very famous school.
I know. None that I can remember, apart from her. There was, I know there was, courses in physical anthropology as well, as cultural anthropology, but that didn't interest me so much, although I took some, But I really don't remember the teachers and tutors I had.
What about in English? Are there any?
The English, there were some famous figures, but I think no really dominant character. I mean, there were, I can remember a number of the professors I had, but there wasn't anybody in particular.
Yeah, who inspired you.
Yeah.
So you went through your 3 years and then...
Four years, in fact,
and then wondered what you were going to do.
Yeah.
And what did you do?
Well, by that time I decided that I wanted to make films. And
you had decided that?
I had, probably in my last year of university or next to last year. At Harvard there's a theater called the Brattle Theater, and I and my friends used to go every week because they changed the program weekly. And we would go and sit in the front row, and we saw an extraordinary procession of films, over those years. And this, of course, was an extraordinarily exciting time in cinema. This was an art cinema, so they were bringing in films by Antonioni, Godard, all the famous neorealists like De Sica. And so I think I began to get my cinema education there. And then at a certain point I thought, well, I'd been doing, trying to write short stories and taking courses in that. And my final year I studied with Archibald MacLeish, and more or less decided I wasn't making much progress in writing, and I was much more fascinated with cinema. And I became a cinephile, I guess, over that period. Then I decided, well, I'll try to find a job in filmmaking.
And what job did you find?
And I found a job in New York for a company that made documentary and educational films called U.S. Productions. And despite its name, it was a rather small outfit, but the fact that they had that name and a wonderful letterhead on their stationery, they managed to get money and grants and so on and to keep going. And there was one of the directors of that company was named Al Butterfield, and he was an historian, and his brother was an historian. Herbert was his brother, yes. So he was a lover of history, and they made quite a few films about history, but mostly films about science. They managed to get money from National Science Foundation and so forth. So I was hired to be a researcher initially, a very, very junior person, just out of university. And my first job was to do research on a film about the White House, because they had this idea they would get Jackie Kennedy to cooperate in making a film about the White House. So I spent days and days in picture archives looking up the history of the White House and getting copies of pictures. They never made the film, but that was my entry point. And I did various other small jobs on mostly research and writing jobs on various fairly uninteresting films. Some were about science, some were industrial films that were their bread and butter. And let's see. Yeah, I sort of made myself useful, I think I would say. And they trusted me and they liked me, and I within a year or two I was being called something like an associate producer, which didn't mean anything. The one thing though that was forbidden there was for me to touch a camera or to touch an editing machine. And they had an editing department of 2 people, I think, and two moviolas downstairs. But these categories were strictly hermetic. You know, you weren't allowed to stray out of a writer-researcher category into a camera or editing job. And so secretly, I think, I took a night school course at Columbia in film production, where I was actually finally able to get my hands on a camera and to edit. And
would they have been shocked to hear this?
Not really, no. Maybe some of them did know, in fact, but I felt it was a bit of a covert activity I was carrying out, you know, a bit subversive of the system. Yeah. But I felt, yes, I really needed to know those things and to
it was a good course.
Get my hands. Fortunately, it was a good course. It was one of these courses where the whole class collaborated on a single film, the subject of which in this case was garbage.
Oh, yes.
And we each went out and shot several hundred feet of film on some aspect of garbage in New York. And then we sort of jointly edited sequences and put it together. And I think mostly I remember filming at the Fulton Fish Market and garbage trucks filling up with garbage and emptying it and that sort of thing. So that was another attempt to get further into filmmaking. And at that point, I was about to be drafted and to be sent as cannon fodder
what date was this now?
to Vietnam. This would have been 62, yeah, around about then. And this was just when the Peace Corps was created. So I applied to the Peace Corps and they offered to send me to Africa.
That's lucky.
Which was lucky, and I went...
Is this an alternative to the draft?
It was at the time, because for the time that you were in the Peace Corps, you couldn't be drafted. Yeah. Although I think even in a few cases they managed to draft people out of the Peace Corps, but There was a bit of a struggle between the two, between the army
It
and...
didn't count as your draft there.
No, they told us that you know, this won't necessarily prevent you from being drafted. But the inclination of the army was to take only younger people, so that as you got older, you were less attractive to them as a soldier. You couldn't be molded as easily. And so when I got out of the Peace Corps, I applied for an educational deferment to go to graduate school, and I was granted that.
What were your political opinions at that time, and did you have any views about being fodder in Vietnam apart from self-preservation?
I think that developed a bit later, you know, after I went to UCLA, to California. I never became, I suppose, a very active activist in any sense, but I certainly began sharing views about, you know, the idiocy of this war and the destruction it was doing, and but as I say, I think that developed a bit more, perhaps during the Peace Corps time. Yeah.
So the Peace Corps, where did you go and what did you do?
I was sent to what was then Nyasaland, which while I was there became Malawi, because it was unusual to send Peace Corps to a colony. In this case, it was a British protectorate. Most people were sent to independent countries, but Malawi was on the verge of becoming independent. So my first year was spent in Nyasaland, and then I witnessed the whole process of the coming of independence, and second year was, it was Malawi. And Dr. Kamuzu Banda then, you know, took power, which he then held on to tenaciously for many decades of madness. And but that was, I mean, that was an extraordinary time.
Time to be there.
And I was a teacher. I was sent to be a secondary school teacher, never having taught anybody in my life, and moreover sent to teach in a teacher training college. So never having taught anybody in my life, I was told I had to teach teachers. But I very much enjoyed my time there, and I suppose I got another view of school life then, perhaps, which has, you know, stayed with me.
And did you do any filming then?
I had a camera, but I didn't have much film. That was the problem. I did a little bit of filming there. I filmed some of the independence celebrations, and which I still have. It's probably some historical record now of some interest. And a little bit of local cultural life. But that was mostly when there were, you know, dance performances and that sort of thing. But I did very much enjoy roaming around in the villages, just on my own. And we all had bicycles, and you know, to use the bicycles on these tiny paths between villages. And I continued to take still photographs.
And that was 2 years, was it?
That was 2 years, from about 62 to 64, at the end of 64.
And then when you came back?
Yeah, then I came back. Another thing that I began to do in Malawi was to read a lot of prehistory and books on prehistory and archaeology. And I had a whole stack of Penguin books that for some reason I became fascinated by the prehistory of Central Africa. And I visited the museum in Livingston, and I had some other peripheral connections with archaeology that was going on there. And at that point, I applied for 2 postgraduate programs in America. One was in anthropology at Berkeley, because Desmond Clark was starting to teach there, and I wanted to study under Desmond Clark. And the other was the film school at UCLA. And at a certain point I had to decide, because they both invited me to come. I was accepted in both programs. And it was a sort of crucial decision I made at a certain point, that I preferred to spend the rest of my life with live people than dead people. And so I opted for the film school.
Yeah. Well, was it a very well-known film school, and was there a particular director? Is it Peter Biela there now, or is it
well, the director was Colin Young.
Oh, Colin Young, yes.
And Colin was, I mean, certainly a major figure in my life from that point on.
He's near Cambridge, I think. He's thinking of moving to Cambridge.
I've heard he's living in Sevenoaks, but he's thinking of shifting to Cambridge. Yeah, definitely should. Yeah. I mean, Colin is one of these people who speaks wonderfully and so eloquently and interestingly, and writes rather little. And I've always regretted that, you know, more of his speech hasn't been recorded over the years.
I'll try and do that.
Yeah.
We'll be in touch. So you did go to UCLA.
Yes, and that was 65. I think I went to UCLA and stayed there really on and off until 1970. By which time I got an MFA degree in cinema and made a number of films.
What is an MFA? A
Master of Fine Arts. They didn't offer a PhD at that time. But the interesting thing that happened was that I was there when they created a new program in ethnographic film. It was must have been one of the very first. And this was Colin Young's idea, really. He somehow talked Wally Goldschmidt, who was head of the anthropology department, into creating this joint program. They got some, I think, Ford Foundation money. And the idea was to bring together anthropology students and film students. And the film students would learn something about anthropology, and the anthropology students would learn about film, and they would collaborate on projects. And a number of our teachers then led projects to make fairly ambitious films. One of the first was in Ireland, another was in Chile, and then I became involved in the third one, which was in Uganda. So back to Africa again. And by that time I'd met Judith. I had asked her to shoot my first film, one of my first student films. And then I shot her a thesis film. And so it sort of began as a working relationship and developed into something more.
Was she on the course with you? I mean, on the same course? Yeah,
yes.
The same year?
Yeah. And then we both went on this project to Uganda, which was directed by one of our teachers. So we weren't there we were simply there as crew. And I was asked to shoot the film. And it was one of these situations in which it was very, very difficult to predict things that would happen. And our professor, Richard Hawkins, who was nominally directing the film, more or less left a lot of the decisions to me about when to start filming, where to be, what to film, because there simply often wasn't time for him to make the decision and to tell me what to do. And so I began taking a more, I suppose, independent role.
This is 16 mil.
This was 16 mil, and it was a film.
Sync sound.
Sync sound, yes. I mean, we were very, very privileged in a way to be I think the first generation of film students who had access to the very latest equipment that was just being invented, really, the Claire camera and the latest Nagra tape recorders. And so essentially we were working with the tools that the professionals were working with in documentary at that time. So,
can I just ask you,
yes.
because you mentioned this idea of the anthropologists coming and learning something about film, and perhaps it's a time, just something that I've often reflected on, the difficulty of bringing these two things together, because it seems to me that if you look at most of the most important ethnographic or anthropological films of the second half of the 20th century, they're actually not made by professional anthropologists. They're made by filmmakers who've got an interest in anthropology. That way around seems to work better than some anthropologists who think, oh, I ought to learn filmmaking and make films.
Yeah.
I mean, you may be in the middle, but quite a lot, like Revolution and others.
No, I think you're right.
Are really, and even some who become, like my friend Peter Loizos, who was trained with me as an anthropologist. I mean, he's a good filmmaker, but you know, his film is not outstandingly good, even though, I mean, he came from television into anthropology, then became really an anthropologist who then used some of his television skills back again. And people like Howard Murphy or Marcus Banks or these people, you know, who are really anthropologists, they make films and they're perfectly good, but they're not, you know, legendary names. So it seems to be a better recipe, really, to be an anthropologically minded filmmaker than the other. Do you think that's...
Well, you know, I think the rationale of this ethnographic film program was to create collaborations between anthropologists and filmmakers, and the anthropologist would supply the knowledge and the concepts, and the filmmakers would provide the filmmaking skills. I think that was a kind of tactical strategy, or a tactical move on the part of Colin Young and Goldschmidt, really to justify the kind of program it was. But I think at the back of Colin's mind anyway, I think the model was always the anthropologist filmmaker, the one person who would combine the skills together. And it was people like that. I mean, that's one reason why Rouche was such an influential character in, you know, in my experience. And
was he an anthropologist? I don't know much about him.
Yes, he was trained as an anthropologist. He was trained initially as an engineer, but then he was later trained as an anthropologist and wrote his PhD on labor migration in West Africa, which is a very detailed, thoroughly researched, you know, fairly conventional anthropological monograph. He also did a lot of work on Dogon, with, but more as a filmmaker, you know. So he was perhaps one of the very few examples we could point to of somebody who combined a love for cinema and skills of cinema with anthropological training.
I mean, would you say that model of combined in one person is the right model? It's just how you do it.
Yeah, I believe so. I mean, but I believe in a kind of personal cinema that's, you know, an authored cinema that is made essentially by one person, and rather than the sort of industrial model of documentary, which involves a sound technician here, a cameraman there, a director there, behind him a producer, and then, you know, an editor again doing that part of the job.
This seems to have been one of the developments of the 60s and early 70s. My own PhD supervisor, I think, was one of the great anthropological filmmakers of the 20th century, but Christoph von Führer-Heimendorf, who filmed throughout India and Nepal. And he did it all himself, and he was the anthropologist and he was the filmmaker. Yeah. But after, in the late 60s, early 70s, the interest in the BBC and elsewhere dried up for his kind of filming, because they wanted to send out professional crews, maybe with an anthropologist. So you've got 5 people, division of labour, and as a result a different kind of
Yeah.
film.
Well, that became the model of the Disappearing World series, these collaborations, and I think they worked occasionally, but very often they didn't work very well at all. I think that was there were always problems about you know, conflicting concepts of what the film should be, what the anthropologist wanted in it, and what the filmmaker wanted. There were some very good ones made, you know, despite that.
Which do you think really worked?
Well, I think the ones that David Turton did with Leslie Woodhead were very good. That series that they did. There were some others. Anka's Big Mocha, I think, is very successful. Very useful for teaching anthropology, and
I use it every year.
yeah, and you know, there were a number of others. The one Hugh Brody worked on about Inuit, and there's one about Ashanti market women, and a couple of others. But this, I think, in general, there were tremendous tensions in the process.
As an anthropologist, you can't really just be standing all the time saying, "Don't film that," you know, "Film that. That's what's important." I mean, but you have to instinctively, very quickly, you have to understand, you know, what is important in the scene, and the cameraman can't do that. They don't know. So they film for visual effect, and you're trying to film for theoretical effect. And it's always struck me as a recipe.
Well, I think it even goes deeper than that, you know, that the filmmaker is after a different kind of knowledge. They're two conflicting concepts, and so it becomes an epistemological question. And how do you define anthropological knowledge? I think this has been consistently the problem that's run through visual anthropology. And very often the filmmaker is making just as rigorous an analysis of what's being filmed as the anthropologist, but it's a different one. And that creates often the problem. Or the anthropologist is interested very often in a kind of didactic and informational film. And the filmmaker is more interested in a kind of experiential knowledge and learning through that. So this creates problems.
Yes. Well, we'll probably come back to this later.
Yeah.
But after this particular experience and the course, I mean, at the end of the course you get your degree, and then what did you decide to do?
Well then, I mean, the next step was going on this expedition to Uganda, and with Richard Hawkins, and he teamed up with Suzette Heald, whom I'm sure you know well. And she was doing her PhD research on the Gisu at the time. And so we made a film about Gisu initiation, which unfortunately was sort of stillborn in a way, because it was, for a long time after the filming was done, nothing happened. And I think Richard had a huge teaching schedule, and he didn't get around to the editing for some time, and then tragically all the footage was lost by the lab. Well, I'll tell you what happened. That all the original negative disappeared from the lab, because the lab moved from one location to another, and when we started looking for the negative, it was gone, and nobody could find it. Many of us, I went to the lab, other people went to the lab, searched everywhere, went through their rooms of stacks and stacks of cans of film, and looking just for something written on a can that might be this material. So all we were left with was the cutting print, which had been run off and survived, but it was very scratched. It was what they call a one-light print, so none of the scenes had been properly graded in the printing. And that was what was left to work with. So that's what Dick and Suzette ended up with editing. And I mean, I didn't have any role in that part of the film anyway.
And that was many years later. It was finally finished, yeah. So that, I mean, Judith and I both worked on that production, and then I think with great generosity, the university agreed to let us stay on in Uganda, keep the equipment for the time being, and try to make a film of our own. And so we had return tickets to America, which we sold, and we bought an old sort of clapped out Land Rover. And we made a kind of connection with the university there, Macfarlane University in Kampala, through Peter Rigby, who was teaching there. And the university more or less agreed to, you know, give us a kind of institutional umbrella if we wanted to make an ethnographic film. And they also lent us things like a tent and camping equipment, and wrote the very necessary letters that you have to take to officials to show that you're all right, you know, that you can, to ask for permission to film in their areas. And so we went up to Karamoja district, which is the northeastern corner of Uganda, where there are herding people primarily. And I was always fascinated by herders and, you know, pastoralists, probably from reading the Newer, I have to say. And that's where I wanted to make a film. And we met some other anthropologists who gave us connections to local people in Karamoja, particularly to a young GA man who had worked on an anthropology project. And we more or less worked out a film that was to be my thesis film, because Judith had finished hers by that time. But I hadn't yet made my thesis film. So we had everything. We had a car, we had a tent, we had camera, recorder, everything except film to put through the camera. We had a subject, you know. And then there were some very sort of fraught months where I was sending telegrams back and forth to Richard Hawkins in California saying, please, can you help us find a small grant to buy some film? And which he did. I mean, you know, he came through with enough money to buy some black and white film. And we had a little bit of color film left over from the Gisu project, which we also ended up using to make a short film. It was a sort of short ends and bits and pieces left over. And with that, then we were able to go ahead, and we ended making one long film called To Live with Herds, and two short films, Under the Men's Tree and Nawi. And those were made in GA territory.
They're often regarded as rather a significant point in visual anthropology. My memory of why exactly they're regarded, was it the subtitling which you did on?
I think that was crucial to it. Yeah.
You were one of the first people to realize the significance of subtitling.
Yeah, I don't know why, because it was such a logical idea.
No, well, they always look like that, aren't they?
Yeah. Yes.
Like Discovering America, but...
Yeah. No, I mean, other people had begun to do it, especially John Marshall and Timothy Ash. But I think what was significant about that period in visual anthropology is that we had the technology suddenly to record synchronous sound, and that meant being able to record people's conversations. And if you record people's conversations, people want to know what they're saying. You can't just talk over them with a voiceover narration. I mean, lots of films do, but there's an imperative somehow to translate. And
I think we'd also grown up looking at subtitled films from Europe.
That's what it's often...
That was important.
People say you've watched this.
Yeah, I mean, all the films from Europe were subtitled in America, so it just seemed absolutely logical if you're filming in another culture, just as if you were viewing a film from Italy or France or Japan, that this could be subtitled.
There were a lot of people who done the voice, the English voice speaking African.
But that was so intrusive, you know. I really hated this dubbed over translation. And I mean, there were a lot of other things operating at that time in terms of the style of the film, the intention, to do with a kind of rejection of many of the principles of documentary that we'd grown up with, and particularly the style of the didactic narrated documentary film where you were told what to think about the images you were seeing. And very often the images did not provide evidence to substantiate what was being said on the soundtrack. They were just background.
They were lectures, illustrated lectures.
They were illustrated lectures. And so I think we were attempting to do two things. One was to begin filming in a different way and to follow the lead of the direct cinema and cinema verite filmmakers, which involved longer camera takes and not feeling that you could run around and get shots from every possible angle and then synthesize those into a sequence that was the type of sequence that was normal in fiction filmmaking and that had been sort of carried over into documentary. To feel that that was too artificial an approach and somehow violated the reality of what you were trying to see, what you were trying to observe. But at the same time, we were very attracted to the narrative possibilities of cinema, and those influences did come from fiction. I think particularly the neo-realist cinema from Italy. These very apparently artless, simple films that had quite a strong narrative line, usually, but allowed people to sort of exist in their own space, and often were acted by non-actors. That, you know, they were not. So they were coming close to documentary in some ways.
What Jean Rouch did later as well.
Rouch later too. Yeah, I'm sure that the neo-realists were very important for Rouch as well.
On your first point about not doing what you see on television now a lot, you know, several cameras and cutting from one to the other. I seem to remember one of the features, because I watched your film quite recently, is that they're often taken in courtyards or you're sitting with the camera or quite low down talking to someone. But I think I read that you had more than one camera and that you could have cut from one to another, but you decided to throw away all the stuff from one camera and just concentrate on the other. Is that right?
We didn't have two cameras, but we might have had, the thing is we might have had two camera positions.
Yeah.
And when it came to edit that material, we felt that the two camera positions were somehow contradicting the whole premise of being a witness to an event, unless you actually show the process by which you got from one position to the other. And I think increasingly we felt that scenes should be filmed more or less from one perspective as a person sitting in that space with the other people. I mean, it might well involve different shots and slightly different angles, but you wouldn't be able to have access to the kind of privileged camera that was very much a part of Hollywood film editing and film, you know, camera style. You know, Hitchcock can have the camera anywhere in a room during a scene. It can be looking, you know, in close-up, looking right up somebody's nostrils practically, and
Yeah.
or it can be far away, it can be here, it can be there. I mean, he very cleverly stitches all these angles together, but it's not, it's a kind of eye of God privilege that allows you to be this invisible observer who can be anywhere in a room, and that may be fine for fiction, but in documentary it begins to feel as if you're violating some principle of being witness to a real situation that's unfolding before you.
Well, it's manipulative, in other words, of the subject, and also you have this choice between the moving camera and the still camera. The still camera, with longish takes, gives you a kind of ethically neutral relationship, whereas if you start circling around and changing things, then you are dominating and altering the subject.
And then the filmmaking becomes more important than what's actually going on. And I think, that's often been the problem with documentary, that the most important thing happening is the fact that a film crew has arrived. And that in turn leads the director to feel that everything has to be recreated, So in the old days, it was quite the norm for directors to direct everybody in what to do and say, would you do that again? And we didn't get that. Let's do another take of it. Would you come through that doorway again? And we felt that we couldn't do any of that. We wanted to reject that directorial approach. In the case of To Live with Herds, we had gone to GA with a fairly conventional idea about making visual ethnography of GA life, and more or less trying to show how the GA had lived in the past and how they continued to live, with a sense that there was a continuity there. But the situation that we actually found was quite different, and we found that the GA were under quite a bit of stress, under pressure from government administration, and there were a lot of problems connected with moving into a cash economy, problems about shortages of water, and the fact that people had become dependent on boreholes instead of traditional water supplies, and whether they should send their children to school, this sort of problem. And we realized that we really couldn't make that more conventional film, that it was much more important to try to make a film about the contemporary situation of the GA and the sorts of pressures they were under. And so that's what the film became, really. It was an attempt to look at how their life was changing, what were the pressures on them, how they were responding to that, what were the benefits and the losses in that. And that, therefore, we focused quite a bit on how both the British administration and the contemporary Ugandan administration was trying to enforce certain patterns of life on the GA that were not really consistent with good management of their economy, ultimately were quite disruptive. And many of these ideas had come really from administrators who belonged to an agrarian society, and there was this effort to settle pastoralists down, to stop them moving around, turn them into agriculturalists. in places where agriculture was absolutely marginal, you know, it was not a good idea. And one paper that was very influential had been written by Peter Rigby called Pastoralism and Prejudice. And I remember reading this in Kampala at the time and finding this a very sort of incisive statement of the problem of many countries in which you have a mixture of agrarian and pastoral societies. And since normally the government and administrations are dominated by the agrarians, you often get this disjuncture. And so the film looks at that problem. And for example, includes a local administrator who is trying to enforce government policy about farming, about sending children to school, whom their parents might need for herding, for example. Requiring people to pay taxes when they have no access to cash except by selling their animals. These sorts of problems. And therefore, if there was a kind of target audience for this film, it would have been, I think, government administrators in that position and people deciding policy.
So you support advocacy anthropology of a sort at that time?
Well, yes, I think there was a strain of advocacy involved in that. Yes. I mean, I think we weren't advocating that the GA should remain as they always had been in the past, or that GA society hadn't evolved, or that they shouldn't send their children to school. Not that, but that there should be a more reasonable accommodation to a pastoral economy, and that you know, government should be more sensitive to that and find ways in which to make these things go better together.
Then did you come back after taking that film?
Yes, then that was a kind of hiatus in our course at the film school, because we hadn't quite finished yet, and I came back, and actually my thesis film didn't turn out to be To Live With Her. It turned out to be a shorter film that I'd shot at the same time, which was finished first, so we called that the thesis film, and it was accepted. That was Nawi. And then we both received our degrees in, I think, 1970, and I was very lucky to get a job working with James Blue, who was a remarkable person who had taught for a short time at UCLA, filmmaker trained in the French film school, but an American by birth, who had made a feature film in Algeria during the war, and quite a number of short films, documentaries that were very interesting. And well, just to put it very briefly, the Rice University in Houston had created a new media center funded by the Menil family, who were M-E-N-I-L, who were French. And they were connected to the Schlumberger oil drilling fortune, let's say. And they were well-known collectors of art, very interested in cinema. And they had created this media center at Rice for a period of about 5 years. They had agreed to fund it. And they funded it very lavishly. And they invited James Blue to come, and I sort of followed on his coattails. He remembered me as a student, and then I applied for the job there that was open. And there were a number of other, you know, very interesting people who passed through various times, including Colin Young, who by this time had gone to start the National Film School in Great Britain, but who would come for periods of 3 or 4 weeks to teach as a kind of visiting teacher. And also Roberto Rossellini came sort of on the same basis. So they were sort of part-time colleagues, but James Blue and I were the sort of full-time, including one other person, David Hancock, who was also a very promising young filmmaker who unfortunately died very young. And we had this idea that we would try to rotate the three of us through the teaching positions in such a way that each one of us would have a year off every third year to do a film project. The thinking being that you can't have people teaching film who aren't practicing filmmakers remaining active. And that looked fine from our point of view, but it was very hard to get the university to see the sense of that. Deans don't like this kind of arrangement very much. But it did work for a while, and the problem was that our filming opportunities didn't come up in that tidy fashion regularly every 3 years. So it was a bit awkward, and we had to bring in other teachers from time to time. And James and I went off, for example, together to make a film at one stage, back to Africa. But that was a very exciting period, because that was the time when Judith and I went back to Africa for 1.5 years to make the Turkana films. And we were very lucky that we were able, just in terms of the university's policies, to be able to go away for that long, do a project and come back.
Were there any features of those films that you felt particularly, there was a moment when you realised you were doing something which was different from your teachers and other people?
The Turkana films. Well, again, I think the main film that we set out to make, which ended up being The Wedding Camels, was fairly conventional in anthropological terms. We wanted to look at Turkana society through a focal event, a crucial event, which maybe in another society might have been mortuary ceremonies or something like that. But in the case of the Turkana, it was marriage, and marriage seemed to focus all the major preoccupations of life in terms of cattle ownership or livestock ownership, alliances between families, questions of polygamy or polygyny in this case. And so our intention really was to find a marriage that would take place and try to follow the whole process through, from the initial negotiations over bride wealth right through to the ceremonies in the end. That's more or less what we did. But we had to wait 9 months for anything to happen, because nobody was marrying until the rains came, and even then there was no guarantee. Excuse me, because if the rains failed that year, marriages would tend to be put off till the following year. And furthermore, people would not, they were rather cagey about declaring who might marry and who might not, because they were always in the middle of negotiations between families over how much bride wealth would be involved. And so you didn't want to reveal your hand too early and say, I actually want to marry into this family. You would say maybe, and if we can come to an agreement, perhaps. So we had to go through a long process of figuring out all the potential marriages that might take place to be ready, and then to select one. And I think that film more or less ran true to our intentions. I mean, I think we were lucky in many ways that it worked out. And then we made 2 other films which were, I think, less predictable one about, in a sense, the ways in which co-wives cooperate or fail to cooperate, and their relationship with their husband. And there was a marriage, a sort of second marriage involved in that film.
What was that called?
Which we followed. This was A Wife Among Wives.
Yes.
And the third became a portrait of the patriarch of the family, Lorang. So we made Lorang's Way as well. So we essentially were making 3 films at once. But we had a fairly clear idea that these would be edited into separate films when we came back.
How did you share the work with Judith?
Well, I was shooting,
Yes.
and she was doing the sound recording, and otherwise we were sharing the decisions about what to film pretty much entirely.
Do you quarrel? Did you
Oh, there were always, there were always disagreements, and I think that, one of our regrets in a way, and I think one of Judith's regrets, is that we couldn't have spent more time, or didn't spend more time really focusing on women's lives, despite that one film. I think she felt that, perhaps partly because, I was holding the camera, I think created somewhat of an imbalance. I really feel that, she's a marvelous cinematographer, and I really feel that over a long period of time we should have done more sharing of these jobs. On the other hand, in many ways, I think we collaborated very well. And then in the editing stage, again, it was a collaboration in the editing. So those films are very much co-directed, co-authored films. The Turkana films took some time to edit, several years, so they came out in successive years, I think. And we did have certain problems in the filming. I don't know if that's of any interest to you,
yeah.
But says something about the remoteness of that place that we were, that it took us, to get any communications back and forth, we either had to go to Eldoret or to Nairobi, and that was sort of a 2-day journey. And one problem we discovered that we'd exposed about 5,000 feet of film and sent it off to the lab, and it took some time to get there, of course, by air freight, and then to be processed. And then there were all sorts of delays getting it back to us. I can't remember quite the details of that, but and when those first rushes came back, we discovered that half of it was out of focus. And it was because the lens that we were using, which had been just tested and checked out before we left, the technician had put one element in backwards, so that it was out of focus at one of the positions in the zoom range. So we lost quite a bit of material there, and then we furthermore had problems with the camera motor burning out, and trying to get that repaired in Nairobi, and seeing if we could get a substitute motor sent in. So there were these sorts of problems. I've prepared a kind of dossier of the telegrams that were sent, and the radio messages, and the letters that went back and forth, and the shipping dockets, and it's quite interesting to look back and see the history of this, because you sort of forget the frustrations. And then our Land Rover was stolen once, and very luckily we found it again. So all these didn't make for the smoothest of times, but I think also I could tell you something about the problems of setting up such a project, because we had originally intended to go back to GA after making the GA films. But in the interim, Idi Amin took power in Uganda, and it became very difficult. We realized that the country was in such a state that to try to go back would have been very difficult, even if we could have got permission, and probably somewhat dangerous. So we shifted the project over the border into northern Kenya. And the Turkana speak essentially the same language as the GA, and are very closely related. And so that was really the closest group culturally that we could work with. So that then took us to Nairobi instead of to Kampala, and there was a whole procedure that you had to go through to get permission to film, and this involved getting a research permit from the President's office, the Ministry of the President, and permission to film from the Ministry of Information. And I spent many hours sitting in the ante-rooms of these ministries waiting to see high officials. And at the Ministry of Information, they told me to get the permission from them, I would have to produce the research permit from the President's office. So I'd go back to the President's office. They'd say, well, first go to the Ministry of Information, get your permission to film, and then we can grant you the permit. But very luckily, Richard Leakey stepped in at a certain point because we'd made an association with the National Museums of Kenya. And in about 3 phone calls, Richard was able to sort this out. This was after a month almost of sitting in offices around Nairobi. And then we were sort of off and running and able to go up to Turkana permanently and begin the process of fieldwork, language learning, meeting people, getting to know the senior people in the homesteads that were scattered around the plain, including Lorang. And interestingly enough, Lorang was the one senior man in the area who wanted to have nothing to do with us. He told his wives not to stop by our compound, not to sell us milk, which some of the other women in the area would bring us milk to buy. So we met a number of other very interesting families in the area, including a very charismatic and jovial senior man with a huge family and many wives of his own and many others that he was more or less taking care of because their husband had died, and their husband was his brother, so he was responsible for looking after the widows. And then at some point we thought, well, we've heard about this Lorang, we must at least go and try to meet him. So we went and talked to him for a bit. And we discovered that he was an extraordinarily interesting person. He was, among all those men, he was really the intellectual. He was, he thought about philosophical problems, and he also had the advantage of having been away from Turkana and come back. So he had a kind of perspective on what was happening there that many of these other senior men didn't have. And we found that we got on very well with him after a short time, and he enjoyed talking about what we were doing and what were some of these problems of social change that were occurring. And after a fairly short time then he said, of course you can film in my compound, there'll be no problem. And from that point on, we ended up filming almost exclusively with Lorang and his family. So it shows that sometimes the people that you get to know first in fieldwork, and indeed especially the people who make a point of contacting you because they think they have something to gain from that, aren't necessarily the best people to work with. So that's really something, just a footnote to add about the Turkana project, that it took that course. And we waited for the first 9 months to see if the rains would in fact come. And it was a very good year for rain. So the weddings went ahead, and Lorang's daughter married, and we were able to follow the course of the bride wealth negotiations and the actual ceremonies until Akai went off to her new family.
And then what? You came back?
Then what? Then I was due back to teach at Rice University, and of course I was late because the wedding season went on, and everythhy was held up till the last minute. And Jim Blue very kindly stood in for me and made excuses to the dean why I hadn't shown up to teach my courses, and so we came back, and meanwhile something had happened, which was that while we were in Turkana, we'd received a telegram, I should go back. We received a letter that had been forwarded all over the place. It had been sent to Houston first and then somewhere else, and finally it had reached Turkana, and it was an ad from the Aboriginal Institute in Australia, advertising for 2 ethnographic filmmakers to essentially re-establish a film unit at the Institute. And previously they had been making films, but in a sense, on a contract basis with Roger Sandel and another filmmaker named Curtis Levy. And they had financed some other films by other filmmakers, but they wanted really to re-establish a film unit with several people, 3 people in it. And oddly enough, they sent me then a telegram inviting me to come to Australia for an interview. We were almost in the middle of this bride wealth negotiation and filming every day, and everything was very tense and very interesting. And there was absolutely no possibility of leaving the situation. Until one day, as I said, the motor on my camera suddenly gave a little curl of smoke came out of it, and it burnt out. And I believe this was the second time we had problems with the camera motor. And I thought, well, there are several possible solutions to this. I could demount the motor, send it back to Rice University, or I could ask them to try to find a substitute motor and send that. Or I could go to Australia. And so I sent a telegram to Roger Sandel and said, please meet me at the airport in Sydney. I'm on my way to Canberra for an interview. And would you please try to get my Eclair motor repaired in the 2 or 3 days that I would be in Canberra. And of course at that point I had sent a reply telegram to the Institute saying, yes, in fact I am coming for an interview, and they arranged a ticket and I managed to get there. And duly delivered the motor to Roger, who came to the airport, and went to Canberra. Slept through the interview because I was completely jet-lagged, and the phone rang in the motel room, and some secretary from the Institute said, Mr. MacDougall, weren't you supposed to be here at 9 o'clock for an interview this morning? And by then it was about 10 or 10:30. And I said, I'll be right over. So I went over and we had the interview, and I don't know, I was in a curious state of mind because they said, these are our plans, this is what we'd like to do. This is the program that we'd like to follow. And I basically said, no, I don't think so. You know, I don't think that's a very good idea, and that's not the way I work, and if I were doing it, I would do it this way and this way and this way. But I didn't really care very much, you know, at that point. Because my mind was back in Turkana. And they then offered me the job. And in fact, Judith and I had applied as a team, a filmmaking team. So in effect, they were offering us 2 jobs. So got in the plane, picked up the motor in Sydney from Roger, flew back to Turkana, or Nairobi, and got myself back to Turkana, and we carried on. And we'd missed a little bit, but actually things had been a bit stalled in the negotiations, so I don't think we actually missed very much. So that led to the next step, which was to go to work at the Australian Institute of Aboriginal Studies, which we did after a year's wait because they had agreed to let me finish up my, I didn't actually have a contract, but I had a commitment to teach for the rest of the year at Rice, and then I was free to leave. So that was how we ended up there. Yeah.
Now Australia.
Australia, yes. Well, we thought we would perhaps stay in Australia for a few years, and we began making films with the Institute. And as it's worked out, we've stayed there ever since. And that was 1975, so it's been over 30 years. Let me tell you something about the prior work of the Institute had been primarily a kind of salvage anthropology, I think, trying to film ceremonies mostly in the Central Desert that were thought to be vanishing and that wouldn't be performed again. So Roger Sandel had done a long series of films with Nicholas Peterson and a few other collaborations he'd had, documenting these events. And also some important work had been done in northern Australia and Arnhem Land. And then Curtis Levy had done a film on the Tiwi Islands and about a mortuary ceremony. And as soon as I arrived in Australia, I was told by the director, Peter Rocco, that they had promised to make another film about the next mortuary ceremony that would be held there. And it was about to take place in about a month, I think, several weeks away. And it was my job to go and do that, never having really read anything about the Tiwi. And so I got in touch with the anthropologist who was associated with the Institute, Maria Brandl, who was doing field work and had been for some time on Melville Island. And I went there and made that film, you know, very much on short notice. It was really with an ethnography in one hand and a camera in the other, and, you know, talking to Maria late into the night to find out what I could from her and be guided by her in what to film and how to film it. And so that was my first experience filming in an Aboriginal community. I did bring in then somebody who'd been involved, not really centrally in the ceremony, but somewhat peripherally, to assist in the editing. He was a Tiwi man who then provided a kind of commentary on the events in the film, because I found that it would have been almost incomprehensible to an outsider what was happening without some sort of guidance, and I didn't want to use a didactic narration. And I thought if it's possible to get an insider, somebody involved directly in the ceremony to comment, that would be a better solution. And so he came to Canberra and worked through the film with me. And I think that was a practice that we followed in a number of the other films that we made in Aboriginal communities. We had various kinds of collaborations with people from those communities. And in a number of cases they did commentaries that we used on the soundtrack. And I think we found it very, very different, a very different proposition to film in Aboriginal Australia after having filmed in these African pastoralist societies, where a great premium is placed on being able to speak well and to speak in public and to speculate on the problems of life, which seemed to be totally different from the cultural style of Aboriginal people in many ways, who, when they speak, I mean, some are very eloquent, but the speech is often highly coded and symbolic and makes all sorts of references to things that insiders know all about, but outsiders don't. And so the problem is, how do you make films that are at all accessible to a non-Aboriginal viewer, or even to an Aboriginal viewer from another group? And I think we struggled with that problem over a dozen years and a dozen films, and in a way never quite solved that problem. And I think at a certain point also we realized that despite trying to enter into these collaborative projects with Aboriginal people, you know, the times were changing, and it was important for Indigenous filmmakers to begin making the sorts of films that we had been making before. And in fact, at the Institute, we had a training program for Aboriginal filmmakers who came on, you know, and spent a year or sometimes longer with us, and then went off and made their own films. And I think after, it must have been about a dozen years, we more or less eased ourselves out of the Institute and proposed that the film unit should be dissolved. And we began then to work independently for a while, trying to work again with grants and that sort of thing. We had, at a very early point, appointed a third member of the film unit, who was Kim Mackenzie, who was more or less fresh out of university and had done some film work. And he went on to make, first of all, Waiting for Harry, which was a wonderful film about an Aboriginal ceremony or ritual, but he solved the problem in a very different way, you know, which I thought was very ingenious. And then he went on to make a number of other films following that. But I think at the end of that period, we more or less all shifted out of the film unit.
Can I just ask about one person you mentioned who very sadly died, has just died, Peter Rucko. What was he like to work with?
Yes, well, Peter Rucko was, I mean, he was a very ebullient character and marvelous to work with, in fact, because he was the sort of person who, once he trusted you, gave you something to do, really gave you your head. He left you to do it as well as you possibly could. He didn't interfere. And, you know, he was very loyal to his staff, and always full of energy, you know, full of excitement. At that period, the the Institute was, the lights would be on late into the night and people were in and out working at odd hours. And it was a very lively institution. I think gradually it became more bureaucratized, more of a sort of 9-to-5 quasi-governmental institution. It somehow lost that spark when Peter left.
And the other person who often you haven't linked him with this is Ian Dunlop.
Yes.
Was he part of this group or?
No, Ian had always worked for the first for the Australian Commonwealth Film Unit, which then became Film Australia. So he was based in Sydney, but he had received some funding from the Institute. And actually I had met Ian first, I think, in 1968 at a conference in Los Angeles. And so when I came to Australia, we re-established contact and became friends. And we conferred about many things. For example, if people wanted to use footage from the films we had made, what sort of policy should we have? How would we deal with the problem of the distress that it might cause Aboriginal communities to have films shown in which people had died since the films were made? Those sorts of questions. And we had to sort of devise policies to deal with those questions. And so, although we didn't see a lot of each other, we did have a lot of contact over the years. Yeah.
So when you became freelance, that's the next stage.
Yes.
Is that when you started filming in other parts of the world, or?
Yes, that was the result of
1985, or?
This was, yes, round about then, a little bit later, 86 or so. I mean, the first thing I did was I had a brief fellowship with the Humanities Research Centre at the Australian National University. I also did some teaching there.
A friend of mine was head of that, I think. He came to Cambridge for a while. I can't remember his name. Do you remember who was?
Well, it was Ian Donaldson.
That's right.
Was the director of the Humanities Research Centre.
Yes, I worked with Ian.
That's right. And Anthony Forge was the chairman of the anthropology department. So I was sort of back and forth a bit. I was kind of visiting fellow at the anthropology department for a while. And then Judith and I applied for something called a documentary film fellowship, which had been established by the Australian Film Commission in conjunction with the Australian Broadcasting Corporation. So it was television plus the Film Institute, or the Film Commission. And every year they awarded a fellowship to a different documentary filmmaker to make a film that would eventually be shown on ABC television. So we applied and we proposed a film about still photography. And we didn't have a very clear proposal in mind actually about what sort of film it would be, but we tried to describe in our proposal the ideas behind it and the fascination that we had with looking at photographs, particularly old ones, and ones that you would find in odd places like bureau drawers and in antique shops and junk shops, and we found it extraordinarily that these documents, which are in a way the most personal sort of document you can have, are so easily lost and just get scattered and separated from the conditions in which they were made, separated from the families that know who the person in the picture is. And we proposed making a film that might, I think one idea we proposed was that we could simply find 10 lost photographs and make a film that would be a kind of detective story about trying to find out who were the people in these pictures, where they had been taken, when they'd been taken, try to trace maybe one of them back to somebody who actually had direct contact with the picture. We didn't end up doing that. We did something quite different. But they gave us the fellowship. So with that, at that point we were invited to an ethnographic film conference being held in India, in the palace of the Maharaja of Jodhpur. And his cousin had organized this conference, and it was attended by many, many people. I had never been to India except to stop over in Bombay airport once, on that time when I flew from Turkana to Australia. And at the conference, we just began talking about the idea for this film with a number of people. And a number of our Indian acquaintances there said, why not make the film in India? You know, we have a long tradition of photography. Almost as soon as photography was invented, there were studios popping up in the major cities of India, you know, by the 1850s, in fact. And there were many sort of amateur photographers in the very early years in India, and then a long history after that. But despite that, there are many people in India who have never had their picture taken, and many others for whom there might exist one picture, perhaps even a picture taken at their wedding, or you know, something like that. And so you have this extraordinary range of experiences of photography. And we thought, why not? You know, why not do this? We had thought of doing it in Australia, possibly. We had thought of perhaps doing it in Africa, where we had some prior experience. But this seemed a very interesting proposition. So we began traveling. We made a bit of a trip around to different places, and we had a kind of notion that we should try to find a large village or a small town in which there was a single photographer, and look at the relationship between the photographer and the photographer's clientele. What sort of pictures were made there, what purposes they fulfilled, what sort of functions they were about. Were they, you know, key rites of passage? Were they, what could they tell us about the community in a way? And we looked fairly widely, and we asked all sorts of people whether we could find such a place, where to look. And we never did find it. We couldn't seem to find that situation. Either the village was big enough so that it had several photographers, or it had none. And then if you went to the next step higher to a slightly larger town, it might have 10 or 20 studios. And I think, you know, we had been reading the novels of Narayan, and like The Sign Painter, and he you know, focuses on these key figures in the small community of Malgudi, and through that person, through the teacher, through the sign painter, whatever, he gives you a wonderful insight into the life of the village. And I think that's what we had thought. Maybe there's a photographer like that. And I'm sure perhaps it exists somewhere, but we didn't find it. So the next step was that we had made contact with an organization called INTAC, which you may know, which is the Indian National Trust for Art and Cultural Heritage. And we met the director of INTAC, Martin Singh, and he said, why don't you go up to this hill town, Mussoorie, north of Delhi, because there's all sorts of photography there going on. You might find it interesting. So we took the train to Dehradun and then went up to Missouri. And indeed, it was a fascinating place. It's a hill town where, British colonial officials went during the hot season, just as they went to Simla, and some of the Indian princes built summer bungalows there, and there were other installations. There was a military hospital and so forth. And lots of tourists, and I would say 99% Indian middle class tourists. And they would flock to Missouri during certain seasons. During the winter it was completely empty, except for the local residents, and then there'd be these waves of people coming from Bombay, and another wave from Calcutta, and another wave of the Delhiites who would come different times of year. And there were all sorts of photographers in Missouri. There were photojournalists. We met a few of them who, produced beautiful coffee table books of the Himalayas, and then there were the old studio photographers who originally had taken pictures of families, had taken portraits on glass plates, and by this time had more or less lost that clientele and were doing sidelines like photocopying. They'd buy a photocopier and make some money from that. Or since there are hundreds of schools dotted around the hills, they would take photographs of class sports events, sports teams, and make a living that way. Or they would take in rolls of film from amateurs and send them for processing. So we found those photographers, and then there were also what they called the outdoor photographers, or tourist photographers, who would take photographs of the tourists who came there every year. Because at that time, not many Indian tourists had their own cameras. So they would pay a bit of money. And the other thing that you would do if you were a tourist would be to go to these photographers. They would dress you in costumes. And then they'd pose you in front of a beautiful backdrop landscape, a real landscape, unlike the other studio, the earlier studio pictures, which have been often against a painted backdrop.
Careful with your arms.
Sorry, yeah.
And this ended up as a photo wallet.
So this ended up as photo wallets. Yeah.
So we've got another 20 minutes. So I want to talk about the philosophy of and political filming as well.
Yep.
So the next. Was this what led you on to the room?
Briefly, indirectly, yes. The next project I did was without Judith, because Judith and I had done Photowalas jointly. But I was asked to make a film in Sardinia by the Ethnographic Institute there. And they had presumably asked me because they wanted a film made about mountain shepherds by a complete outsider who would bring a different perspective to the subject. And the director of the Institute believed that most of the films that had been made about shepherds were rather stereotyped, and he wanted a fresh approach, and he had seen some of my films. So that more or less took up the next 2 years of my life. And
what did that end up as?
And that's a film called Tempos de Baristas. And eventually we made that as a co-production with BBC, which is one of the few times, in fact, that there has been television money involved. you know, in my films. I was very lucky that I happened to be about to make that film just at the point at which the BBC was putting on a series called Fine Cut. And the commissioning editor was Andre Singer. First of all, because British television rarely showed long documentaries, and this was meant to be a feature-length documentary. And secondly, of course, because I think my type of filmmaking didn't follow the usual formats of television. But I walked into Andre Singer's office, discussed it with him, and you know, within about a half an hour, he had agreed to co-finance the production. And that allowed me, with the money from the Institute, to spend much longer on it, to take my time, to be able to work in the way that I like to work. And also, incidentally, to hire Di Vaughan as editor, who had worked with us on Photowallahs, and from whom I learned a tremendous amount about editing, and I wanted to work with him again.
He's a very famous editor, of course.
He's a very famous, probably the finest editor of documentary and British television, I would say, and also a very fine writer on cinema, and also now a novelist. I mean, he's published 4 or 5 novels. First one published when he was 60. So he was a wonderful person to work with. But apart from Di, we really haven't worked with other editors. I mean, there's one other occasion, but...
Do you edit your own films then?
Yes, yeah.
That's interesting.
Yeah. And have ever since Tempos de Baristas. And of course we edited many of the Aboriginal studies films also ourselves. Yeah, so that that project finished in 94, I believe. Yeah, and the film went out in 94. We actually made a slightly longer version of the film than the BBC broadcast. The one they put to air was, I think, 90 minutes, and the version, I suppose you could call it the director's cut, was 100 minutes, which is the version I prefer, because to make the BBC version, I think we had to take out the 4 scenes that perhaps I prized the most in the film, but that weren't absolutely essential to the, you know, the framework, the kind of skeleton on which the film hung. So that finished, and then the next project was the Dune School project, and that occurred because I was contacted by an Indian anthropologist named Sanjay Srivastava, who was completing his PhD on 4 schools of northern India. And although he'd been raised and educated in, yeah, Sanjay was educated and raised in India, but he was doing his PhD at Sydney University. And he just got in touch with me and he said, you know, do you think this is a subject that would lend itself to ethnographic filmmaking? And we had a number of discussions after that, and I thought it would, you know, that it would be a very interesting proposition to look at a school in this way, particularly a residential school. So we had various ideas about collaboration on projects, but in the end he got a lectureship and went off to teach, and I ended up doing the project. When I visited the school for the first time, and it's very close to where we had filmed Photowallahs, I must say. I knew the area. I had heard of the school. I had visited some other schools in the district. And I went and met the headmaster. And you can imagine that, many heads of institutions, particularly schools, might be somewhat threatened by the idea of a filmmaker coming in and making a film about their institution. But he was remarkably open and welcoming. And he said, if you did this, it would give us a different perspective on ourselves, which would be very valuable. And he also said that, these students, their education is very word-based. They study Shakespeare and they read lots of books, but they're not really very critical about visual images. And despite the fact that they're surrounded by television when they go home, they go to the movies, and everywhere around them are images in advertising, in public media. And he said it would be very good for them to have a filmmaker around, because it would raise their consciousness about how film works on them, in a sense, how they're affected by it, and they'd learn to read films better. So when I walked out of his office, I more or less suddenly had a project, having thought perhaps there might be a possibility here. When I walked in, I'd more or less committed myself to coming back. And I found I was able to do this work now on a fairly small budget, because by this time digital video had come in, and it suddenly made possible the sort of filmmaking that we'd been doing before, but at a much cheaper price.
And what sort of cameras did you use?
I started with a Sony Model 200, which was one of their first DV cameras. It was actually a DV cam format, and it was a sort of medium-sized camera that you held on your shoulder. I should say that Doon School is probably the most famous school in India, and it's obviously it's an elite school. It's a boys' boarding school, and it was one of the three schools that Sanjay had written about and studied. The other two were Mayo College in Rajasthan and Lawrence School, which is up in the hills. And what happened next? Well, one thing that happened, we were actually talking about the possibilities that digital video opened up, because in addition to making it much cheaper to make films, it suddenly permitted one-person filmmaking in a way that 16 had not. I had actually made one film alone with 16, and it was a kind of technological nightmare to record sound and shoot with 16mm at the same time, and you were constantly in the back of a car changing magazines or changing batteries in microphones and this sort of thing. But digital video convinced me that I could work alone, and in the context of a boys' boarding school, it really didn't seem that appropriate to have, to work as a husband and wife team, just because of the sort of access that you needed to have. I had actually made a kind of verbal agreement with ABC Television and BBC to do a film on Doon School, but at a certain point BBC pulled out. I think primarily because they'd had a change in commissioning editors, and the new commissioning editor looked at the project, and I'd written to him and said, what's happening? Can we proceed with this? And he wrote back and said, well, it was sort of a one-line reply saying, this has been tried before and it never really works, and we're not really interested. So that was actually a blessing, because it liberated me in a way, and not to have to think in television terms. And with my, university research budget, I was able to pay the costs, which were largely a few airplane tickets back and forth, and the cost of tape, which was negligible, and the equipment was provided by my research budget, or by the university, was already there. So I was able to go into the Dune project without having to say, I will make such and such a film of such and such a length, and to outline everything that would be in it, or that I hoped would be in it. And I was very open to the possibility that it might be one very long film, or it might be 25 10-minute films. I wanted to see what the situation would throw up, and so I began working on a film which eventually became this film called Dune School Chronicles. It's a quite long film, it's over 2 hours. It's divided into 10 chapters. It's a kind of framing film, perhaps, for the others that I made later. And it looks at the ideology of the school as well as the experiences of some of the protagonists of different ages. There's one who's a new boy in the school. There's another who's sort of midway through, about 14, 15 years old, and another who's 16, 17 years old. And they represent different personalities, different responses to the school, and different age groups. Part of the quid pro quo of allowing me to film at the school was that I would train some student filmmakers. And I did do that with a group of about 8, I think, who for a while turned out a kind of fortnightly film magazine, a video magazine. And that was shown to the school on movie nights, when they showed another film. They made a number of episodes of that. And then they dropped the camera, the school camera, in the river, and that put an end to it for a while. But that remained quite a separate activity from my work, and I kept them quite separate. Also in that first film, I was interested in looking at school texts, that is, texts that I found in the school archives, in the school newspaper, statements that I eventually used as epigraphs for each of the 10 chapters in the film. So it combines text with a kind of observational cinema approach in some cases, in other cases a kind of more participatory approach, and some interview material. I also began experimenting, inserting still images from time to time, just to see how that would give you a different perspective on what you were seeing in the film, how it would make you as an audience stand back and see things differently when you suddenly froze the image. And with these digital cameras, it's very easy to do that. The video cameras, you push a different button, and you can get a 20-second still frame. And that's really what led me to start doing that. Then I went on and I made 4 more films, and they become progressively more narrowly focused. So the next films deal with smaller groups of primarily first-year students, and the final film is a portrait of one student. And my rationale, I think, was that through the first-year students who were discovering the school for the first time and learning its rules, and we as an audience could more or less coattail on them and discover the school with them. At least that was the thinking behind that. Dune School Chronicles was, in a way, a product of a change of direction in my own thinking, because I had originally gone to the school with the idea that here are students coming from different parts of the country meeting here. It's a kind of crossing point. And they represent different religions, because Dune is it's a very secular school, and it has Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs, Jains, a few Christians. It's really varied in that sense. In terms of class and caste, no, it would tend to be more middle class, upper middle class, and upper caste probably, or well,
clean caste.
Yeah, and what I realized when I came to the school was how homogeneous it was, in a sense, and how strong were its traditions, its rituals. It had been modeled on, the model of the British public school, with some modifications, Indian modifications. And it had been created to really train a generation of Indian leaders who would take over from the British after independence. So the function of the school, in a sense, was to feed people into the governing elites and other elites of India. And it stressed, therefore, leadership, independence, self-confidence, being an all-rounder who was able to get on with all sorts of people, do different things, all very good in themselves, but in other ways it was rather more regimented and controlled. And I remember seeing, I've written something about this, but I remember when I had been at the school for a few weeks feeling, I'm in the middle of a stage play somehow. This is a drama being enacted for somebody. Because a bell would ring, people would rush onto the stage, or dressed in a particular uniform, another bell would ring, they'd disappear. An hour later they'd appear in a completely new uniform for some other function, and I began to think, is it possible to look at a small-scale community like this in the way that you would look at a small-scale society? Or even bring some of the tools of art criticism or literary criticism to this? Could you look at a school as a created work in some sense? And that in turn led me to begin thinking about the sort of aesthetic that was prominent in the school, the social aesthetic of the school. And so that influences some of the decisions made in making that first film. Trying to look at the rituals, the various patterns of gesture, of speech, behavior, of the physical setting, in fact, that creates a very specific cultural environment and physical environment that people come into and become attuned to and reproduce and so forth. And the other films are less explicitly about that, but that's still somehow in the background, that idea of social aesthetics. So I went on to make films that focused on certain individuals and groups, primarily in the first year.
How long were you actually in the school?
Over a period of about 3 or 4 years. I was there perhaps 12 or 14 months, for periods up to 4 months at a time.
Well, two obvious questions. One is, did you ever have any really serious problems? I mean, you did this in British boarding schools now with the atmosphere of terror and fear of abuse and the rest of it. Filming privately so on and so on. There might be awkward moments and investigations and so on. Were there any problems?
No, not at all. I think that sort of sense of that climate of fear wasn't present to begin with. We're talking about 1998 or 97 when I began, through about 2000, and I don't think it didn't really exist in India, that anxiety.
Which is now existing in Australia in a serious way, as you know.
Yeah, and I still don't find it in India, in fact, particularly.
No.
But I think these films could probably never have been made in Britain or in Australia, simply because the conditions of my project were that I had the permission of the school. The board of governors of the school had been consulted and had agreed to let me do a long-term research project in the school using video. But I didn't have to, for example, go through a procedure of getting written permissions from 500 sets of parents. I think that would have been absolutely impossible.
Which you would in the British.
Yeah, and so probably, it would be impossible to make films like this here.
The second question was there anything that really particularly shocked, surprised, or amazed you in the filmmaking about the place? Was it sometimes when you're in the anthropological situation in very different societies, something stands out as surprising?
Particularly surprising. I don't think so. I don't think there was anything that particularly shocked me or surprised me. I think there were a lot of parallels with other schools that my own boarding school had prepared me in some ways for many of the things that went on. I mean, there were the sort of classic problems of teasing, bullying, ragging that went on under the surface and that I would catch glimpses of from time to time that boys told me about, and some pretty bad things, in fact, happened, and various kinds of abuse, physical, sexual, psychological, all these things were there, but they're probably there in many schools. I found that the school tried to account for almost every minute of the students' time, and they ended up being quite stressed, especially toward the end of the term when they'd been just going non-stop for 4 months, and I think the school itself was trying to find solution to this because it was a case of more and more opportunities in a way being presented to the students, being piled on, but many of them you'd find they were obliged to be in two places at the same time for two things they'd agreed to do, and were constantly running back and forth, and there was a complex sort of bizarre punishment system which I didn't find shocking, I found interesting, which again is reproduced in other schools, and the most common form was what they call change and break, where you have to run back to your dormitory, change out of one uniform into another, run back, have a chit signed, run back, change into perhaps a third uniform, run back, have another chit signed, etc. All done in the mid-morning break, this sort of thing. And I mean, there were certain things that stood out. For example, the preoccupation with clothing I found very interesting, which is that demonstrates, and the elaborate system for simply handling the amount of clothing, laundering it, getting it back to the students, and the way in which it was accompanying all the changes of various activities within the school. You definitely wore a particular uniform for a particular activity. That was, of course, part of this social aesthetic, certainly, that I was interested in.
Perhaps we ought to move on to, this has got to about 2001 or something like this, 2002. Is there one further phase of filmmaking on another theme to add in, or?
Well, there are two further phases that are on a related theme, I would say. The first is that after finishing the Dune project, the last film was edited in 2003. I began filming at a school in South India called the Rishi Valley School. And it's a very different type of school. Although it's a boarding school, it's co-educational. It starts from a slightly earlier age, and it's based on the ideas of Krishnamurti and his general philosophy, but also his ideas about education. And so it has a kind of progressive educational philosophy, which was actually very similar to the one at Putney School where I went. You know, all you had to do was substitute John Dewey for Krishnamurti, and you had a very similar outlook in many ways. So I began filming there as a kind of counterweight to the Dune project, and I've made 2 long films there and several shorter ones which are actually in collaboration with students, sort of projects in observation, in fact. And then as a third project, I began filming and living at a shelter for homeless children in New Delhi. So in fact, I have 3 sites of institutions for children in India that I'm comparing in different ways and trying to, document and analyze.
The third sounds very challenging, but...
It was difficult, and I'm just now at the point where I've finished a fairly complete edit of the film I'm going to make from that material. It's going to be quite long, quite complex, and when I go back to Australia, I'll be working on the completion of that.
How do you edit? Do you have a professional edit suite, and do you use
Avid
or something?
I use Final Cut Pro now on a Macintosh computer system.
At home or in the office?
It's at the university. I have an editing room next to my office, and I'm able to go in there and try to shut myself off from the rest of the world.
Turn your mobile phone off.
Yes. No, I didn't have a phone in there for a long time, on purpose.
And do you want to say anything before we come to one or two theoretical things about the future or future projects? Or?
Well, only that the last bit of filming that I've been involved in, Judith and I went together back to Rishi Valley School because I had much better access to the boys' lives than to the girls' lives, and I had always hoped Judith would be able to come and do some filming with the girls. And also I think I get on better with the boys than the girls. And so the last time we went back, not for very long, a bit over a month, and she filmed a group of girls and I filmed a group of boys of the same age, so they're parallel. And we haven't even touched that material yet except to log it and digitize it, but we haven't begun editing that material.
Right. Just because I kept you a very long time, but just one or two sort of wider thoughts about life, and perhaps this should be the last question, but it's occurred to me first, which is if you were now, I know the world has changed, but if you were now giving some advice to someone who is graduating in anthropology or film about the sort of project that or any techniques or any sort of fatherly advice to the young generation that you'd like to put on.
What would I tell them?
Yes, what would you tell them?
Well, I think I'd say don't be afraid to start making a film if you don't know everything about the subject already. Because I think too many films are a kind of illustration of predetermined conclusions. And perhaps that's because, the classic way to do anthropology was to do your field work, to do your research, then to write it up as a separate publishable project. And I think filmmaking is very different, that the camera itself becomes, or potentially can be, a way of exploring your subject. And therefore I feel very much that films should be a process of research, not simply a sort of ex post facto publication of some previous research. Doesn't mean I don't think research is important, but I think that it's partly to do with the nature of the kind of knowledge that films can give you. That I think it's important to go into filmmaking in this way, in an exploratory way, because I think you learn things with a camera that you would never learn without one, even if you don't actually end up maybe making a film at all. You may, simply because the camera gives you access and leads you into situations through which you learn.
I wouldn't have had this conversation with you without a camera.
Exactly, yes.
No, I absolutely agree.
Yeah. So that's one piece of advice. The others are fairly simple. I mean, I don't really enjoy technology for its own sake. I think it's a useful tool. We need to master it, but I think there's certain basic principles that will allow you to begin filming. For example, just being able to hold the camera steady. That's the first thing we teach in our video workshops. Just learn to hold the camera steady, find a frame of interest, and don't start playing with the camera. Let us see what's happening. Let us look at what you find interesting.
Very good advice. Any more?
Well, those are sort of fundamental, but...
Well, moving on to what seems to me something I got out of one of your books recently, and also seems to many anthropologists who've been taught to try and convey the complexity of other worlds through writing, and it's the theme of this conference you're just about to start. There's always supposed to be a tension or contradiction between the two forms of conveying knowledge and exploring the world, i.e. writing and filming. One very good at abstract communication through high-level symbols, and the other through direct, close association between the object you're seeing and the thoughts. And it's often thought that this tension is irresolvable. You're either going to have to go for the experience, the sensations, the emotions, and drop a lot of the more complex thought, or you're going to do the writing where you can convey that, but you lose some of the sensory experience. Yes. Do you think there is any way around this?
Well, to begin with, I don't think it's quite as clear cut as that, because I think films can be, they can reflect complex thought in certain ways. I think what they're not good at is making propositional statements about the world. I think partly because they're dealing extensively with specific cases, and they don't have this ability to summarize from many examples. I mean, that's one part of it. But I think films can be highly analytical, nevertheless, in the way in which they explore their subject, in the kinds of juxtapositions they create, the kinds of lines of reasoning they follow. But I do agree there are some fundamental differences. but I think, for one thing, words are incredibly important in film as in writing. And words are used in so many ways, in conversations, and they're used in texts, in titles you could put up. Even the main title of a film tells you a lot about what you're getting into. And, through words we learn a lot about people's emotional lives as well as their intellectual lives. I think this was one of the things that attracted us to Lorang and the possibility of making a film about a Turkana intellectual in a way, or if not an intellectual, somebody who had thought quite deeply on certain matters. And I suppose there's a connection with children also. I find children have skills that we tend to underestimate as adults, intellectual skills, and by 12 or 13 they can understand 99% of what well-educated adults can if you talk to them about it, in a reasonable way. So, words are important, but by the same token, I don't like films to become absolutely word-dominated by simply being interviews or simply being having voice-over commentary with illustrative shots. I think the camera can be a kind of personal writing instrument, you could say, and a way of, as Edgar Morin, I think, said, a way of, plunging into the world like a diver, and allowing other people to have the sorts of experiences that you've had, and conveying, what it means to be living according to a whole set of assumptions and physical surroundings and principles and personal relationships that are often very, very difficult to communicate in writing unless you're a marvelous novelist like Tolstoy. And so I think I move from one mode to another often, and therefore films, I think, can also work in multiple modes and can layer these modes, because one or another approach is appropriate to one or another objective. And I think we have to use as many as we can, use them as richly and effectively as we can.
I think that's probably a very nice point to end on.
Okay.
Is that all right?
Yeah, that's fine.